You know more about Jesus than anyone did in the narratives we've been looking at so far in John's Gospel, more even than Jesus' closest disciples. You know one thing more than anyone did in John's Gospel, except for Jesus himself. And that one thing is central to John's Gospel, and it is central to the mission of Jesus as Messiah and Son of God. Now, today's passage picks up where we left off from last time. The Jerusalem Supreme Court has decided that Jesus must go, and there is now an arrest warrant, charges to be decided later. But a major feast is approaching, and it's a feast to which all Jews, if possible, should attend. Would the wanted Jesus appear? So let's hear the passage from John's Gospel. And I'm reading from John chapter 11, verse 55, through to John chapter 12, verse 11, and I'm using the ESV. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know, so that they might arrest him. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." When the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came, not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Now, if I'd read to the end of the section, which we'll look at next week, we would see that we are in a kind of symmetrical club sandwich. And it begins with Jews looking for Jesus, and then Jesus explaining the one thing that we know and they didn't. Then we have the exasperation of the authorities who are out to get him. Then we come to the climax, which hopefully we'll look at next week, which is Jesus approaching Jerusalem as the recognized Son of David, coming in the name of God. And after that, we have the exasperation of the authorities again. And then finally, Gentiles now looking for Jesus, which triggers Jesus again to explain the one thing that we know, but they didn't. So today's passage starts with curious people scouring the temple precincts for Jesus. There's an arrest warrant out for him, but will he come? Now, at the last feast that John described, the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus kept his head down and came late. But will he come at all to this one? Now, by now, we know that John uses feasts a lot in his account and shows how Jesus' actions and words are associated with that particular feast, whether it's a marriage feast in Cana of Galilee or whether it's one of the 4 feasts that are centered around the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this feast is Passover, the feast that defines the first month of the Jewish calendar, their lunar year. And in the center of that first month, at full moon, the Passover lambs are slaughtered. 1 per household or per group of households. It's done so that a lamb is neither too little nor too much for those eating it. And that lamb is slaughtered in remembrance of that first lamb whose blood protected the firstborn of Israel when they were called out of Egypt. And it was called Passover because thanks to the blood of the lamb, God's judgment passed over them at that time. Now, in a short time in John's Gospel, we will see that that past event, was a sign for the ultimate passing over of judgment. Therefore, it says, Jesus came out of hiding to be ready for his final hour. And he comes to Bethany, a couple of miles outside Jerusalem, the village of Lazarus, for a thank you banquet. Now, some of you, when I read this, may have thought, I've heard this in other Gospels as well. So just let me step away from the text for a moment. None of the Gospel writers are giving us a fly-on-the-wall documentary, leaving us to pick the bones out of it. But rather they are selecting material to emphasise a particular point. And Matthew, Mark, Luke and John could describe the same incident from a different perspective, with different details included or excluded. And we can confuse their messages if we try to fuse them together, fuse and interpret one gospel in the light of another. Now, sometimes comparison is useful to stop us going beyond what one of them is saying, reading between the lines to try and discover something which is not their main point. But generally, each of the four Gospels stands alone in the sense that they are presenting a portrait of Jesus in a particular way. Now, each of the four Gospels records an incident of a woman anointing Jesus with perfume. Matthew, Mark, and John here are similar. Luke seems to be a different account altogether, and there is no good case to identify the unnamed prostitute in Luke's account with this Mary. So read every gospel in the light of itself. So coming back now into the text, we're not necessarily at Lazarus' house. Where Lazarus was refers to the village of Bethany. And there is quite a large crowd here. We discover later that Jesus has his disciples with him, so that's 13 of them. We've got Lazarus, Mary and Martha, so that takes it up to 16. And as we're in Bethany, where a lot of people crowded around Mary and Martha during the funeral, possibly a lot from the village are there as well. So we may well be in someone's sizable house where this banquet is being put on to thank Jesus, and also Lazarus is there too as a guest of honour. So we have in this house that Martha is serving. We're not clear, it's not clear who cooked. Lazarus, as a man, is doing nothing whatsoever, but he is perhaps another guest of honour. And that leaves Mary, who therefore, says the text, does this extraordinary act. So perhaps brother and sister were in on it as well. Now, nard, we think, comes from the plant in India, and it would be a very expensive perfume to have. And particularly if it's made from pure nard, which this were. And Judas Iscariot helpfully tells us that this could have been sold for 300 days' wages, a denarius being a typical labourer's day's wages. Now, given a labourer would never work on the Sabbaths or any of these festivals, that would be about a year's salary. And given that he probably didn't have work every day, even more. So what we have here is Mary blowing in today's money, possibly something that could be sold for £10,000, £20,000 on soap for Jesus' feet in this act of grateful self-abasement. Because hardly anybody washes someone else's feet. I'm told a lowly slave might do it. And no reputable woman lets down her hair in company but keeps her head covered. Now, we mustn't think of them sitting around a table like we do. They were reclining to eat, led on the floor, with their feet facing away from the low table where the food was served and where they would all help themselves with their fingers. So all the feet are pointing away from the table and easily accessible to Mary. And Mary lets down her hair and uses it as a towel for his feet. And as she pours the perfume and wipes it off in her hair, the fragrance, John says, filled the whole house. The house probably smelt better even than the temple full of incense. This is worship. In Mary's eyes, Mary is nothing compared to this man. There is no service too menial for her. She worships at his feet. It's a beautiful picture. And not a bad example of what follows from believing in Jesus, because belief is not cerebral. It is not intellectual assent to certain things being true. It is a personal knowledge and understanding of Jesus that leads to total worship. Obedience does not make us a disciple. but discipleship makes us obedient. Judas thinks it's a waste of money. The poor are more important than Jesus. Think of the good that could be done with the proceeds of sale. Think of what I could skim off the top as the money goes into the money bag. We have here face-to-face, true and false discipleship. On the one hand, we have a trusted apostle, and on the other, a mere serving woman. Only one is a true disciple. In the eyes of the apostle, Jesus is not worth a jar of perfume. Just 30 silver coins. Jesus defends the true disciple, and now we come to the crux of the matter. This, says Jesus, is for my funeral. Lazarus is living proof that Jesus gives life to the dead. But very soon, probably within a week, Jesus himself will be laid to rest in a tomb. Now, we knew that was coming. That was the one thing that we know that those at the time did not. Now, breaking my own rule, not to interpret one gospel in the light of another, the other gospels tell us that Jesus repeatedly told his disciples that he was going to die and the manner of his death. But they either interpreted that as figurative speech, which they couldn't understand, or Jesus was just plain wrong. His close followers did not expect him to die. Or if he did, it would be some glorious death in which they would all go down fighting. Now, we know that Jesus is about a week away from the most demeaning death then possible, but nobody expected that then. A Messiah that suffers and dies for his people is remarkable. It was all there in their scriptures, and it's all acted out for them at that time in the various temple sacrifices. But that did not fit with popular notions of messiahship. The shepherd of Israel dying for Israel? Surely not. But this is the feast of Passover, and it will be the Passover to end all Passovers. It is an offensive thought, isn't it? That for judgment to pass over God's elect, God's chosen people, Jesus' blood must be shed as a cover, a protection from judgment. What are those not covered? Surely such an expensive sacrifice is not for me. It's for other people, other really evil people, not for the likes of me. But John's gospel is stark. Believe in this Jesus and live because of him, or perish. That is offensive to us self-righteous people, but it's music to the ears of those who make no such claim, who are humble and contrite in spirit, and perhaps weighed down with the guilt of past offences. What love the Father and love has shown. Don't measure God's love by how materially blessed you are right now, but measure it by this sacrifice. Now, all this is to come in John's Gospel. In Bethany, there is just the wonder of this man. And the Jews who have been looking for him in Jerusalem hear that he's in Bethany, and they have seen and heard about Lazarus as well. So off they go to find Jesus and Lazarus. And perhaps they ask Lazarus for his story, and they start to believe in Jesus because of what he says. And the authorities are now furious that Lazarus is encouraging belief in Jesus. He'll have to go as well. See, some people will never be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. There's more to belief and unbelief than mere facts. The secrets of the heart, the secret motivations are being exposed. Jesus' hour is approaching. Can you see now how the time of shame will also be the time of great honour? Can you see that the greatest work of the one through whom all things were made is now to die for his people? Remember that we trust in Christ crucified, and before God we can trust in nothing else, especially not in our so-called righteousness. Immediately after this, we have the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And I hope next week we can join in spirit with those crowds who waved palm branches and cried, "Son of David, God save us now. You have come in the name of the Lord." They cried out to him, "Save us." And so Jesus rides on in lowly pomp to save them. Next time.